realistically drawn characters. Why do they all suck?
Have no fear, Princess. I will rescue you with the help of my illustrious magic sword. I can just grab hold of my magic sword.
Clearly, I need to design a really easily animatable yet realistic character myself. Well, no time like the present. 1, 2, 3, 4. This, of course, did not happen. This project took me over 3 months to complete. Why? Well, I wanted to make an advert for my ToonBoom Harmony guide, and let's be honest, in an advert you've got to sell yourself, show yourself off. So to do that, I wanted to tackle a really fancy character. In this case, a more human, a more realistic character. Now, human characters, realistic human characters are very tricky to get right. You can't hide behind exaggeration as much. They're much more rigidly defined by muscle and bone than a cartoon character like me is. They are, quite honestly, a right old pain in the bum to get right, particularly if you don't want them to be as rigid as cardboard. Now, making characters like this, you could just cover every inch of them in envelope deformers and let the animator get on with it. But apart from being a very lazy approach, it tends to yield very poor results since animators have deadlines to honour, and alterations in the work often require so much effort that it's not uncommon for animators to deliberately animate the puppet in a fairly basic way just to get the job done at all. In my time as a stop-motion animator, I've been used to animating with puppets in a 3-dimensional space, which has numerous advantages over a 2D puppet. One of the main ones being that the foreshortening of limbs happens automatically. You point a limb at the camera and the limb foreshortens, because reality. Now, this is something that you have to fake when making 2D puppets all the time, and some animators tend to forget this or find foreshortening so difficult due to the puppet's complex construction and start animating it like a paper cutout. All very Captain Pugwash. Now, I wanted to make a character that was reasonably intuitive to work with, lots of detail, but organised in a way that if the animator needs it, they can get to it, and if they don't, it hides itself away. In fact, I wanted a fair amount of the work to be done automatically by the rig, foreshortening, twisting, all to be one movement for the animator to make rather than 16. Now, this was new territory for me. A lot of these concepts I'd already played with a bit, but never to quite this level, so there was quite a bit of research and development involved. Not only did I want this character to have a control method which didn't change depending on which direction she faced, but I also deliberately designed this character with a lot of known issues to make it extra difficult for me. The collar, defined muscles, long hair, long nose. All of these things are difficult to make since they don't allow for much wiggle room. If something goes wrong, it'll show up. So naturally, being the masochist that I am, I took them all on at once. Because I'm a maniac. I go mad, so you don't have to. The head was the most straightforward part, though I wanted to get more complex with the construction of soft bodies for extra control, particularly in the jaw, and I wondered how many techniques I could blend together before either the computer or I exploded. Now, I'd been tinkering with constraints for quite some time, and I'd become gradually more and more confident with them. Now, if you know what you're doing, constraints really can be the magical flesh glue that binds a puppet together in the most amazing way, better than a deformer, I think. Constraints kind of create a squishy rig which kind of sits on top of an existing hierarchy that you are already creating, and since this adds another layer of complexity, it can be a tricky thing to mentally process when making an already fairly complicated rig structure. Now, to help me with this, I started to create constraint-based areas of the rig using pegs in the usual way, but labelling them as nails instead. Now this way I could easily see what role a peg was playing in my rig. If it was just labelled a peg, I knew it was just a peg, but if I labelled it as a nail, I knew it must be at either the top or bottom part of a two-part constraint system. So I made the head in the conventional master controller way, with extra squishiness in the jaw and mouth. Now the nose uses a new technique of mine which I'm both pleased and a little frustrated with. When you have a large point of flesh protruding away from the body, you don't just draw its whole outline, you tend to just draw suggestive parts of it which kind of roll around the outline of the element in a certain way to give it necessary definition. Now the nose has three parts which have lines that slide around using a mechanism of my own design. The great thing is that because this uses absolutely no cutters, it's light, and it really allows the CPU breathing space for other areas of the rig. Now the bad news is that at the moment the end result can only be seen in a final render, so a render preview node has to be used to see what you're doing as you're going, leading to some other problems. Now I'm not sure I'd do it this way again, not sure, but for now this will have to do. I mean, it does work, so it's not at all a failure. Now like the jaw, I wanted to make the hair squishy and floaty with minimal effort by the animator. So part of this setup required a nail to be fastened to the upper body to give the hair a kind of gravitational centre. So that leads us on to probably the most difficult part of the rig, the upper body. Now this took ages to get right. I was determined to create arms that not only had muscle tone and didn't look flat like cardboard, but really did look alive with tension and energy, but was also ridiculously easy to animate, i.e. no envelopes allowed. Now there was a video I came across on YouTube by Jason Schleifer, I think that's his name, which did something with constraints which I had never seen before, and since his video seemed to leave some crucial information out, I reached out to him to see if he could enlighten me. Now unfortunately he'd forgotten some of his crucial elements that he'd put in, so he was unable to help me, but he actively encouraged me to find out how to recreate it. I tried several attempts and finally figured out how it was done, and I started modifying the construction so parts of the arm could be shifted in Z more conventionally. Constraints use two or more pegs to position the drawings in the camera view, and moving one peg in Z tends to yield slightly bonkers results which can be very frustrating when animating, a problem I solved with a little lateral thinking and a lot of walks around the park. I must have made about 10 different types of arm joint. One using the ancient glue node, one's using auto muscle, all sorts of things. Eventually I opted for a blend of automatic mixed with manual control in the form of special construction of constraint and scale deformers, which would allow for easy foreshortening, reliable Z depth changing and easy muscle tone tweaking. Even now I'm still not sure if I've got it totally down, but it works pretty well and is very fast considering what it can do, so I'm going to go with that. Now the construction of these arms is fairly complicated, so you really need to have it shown to you in a diagram format and step by step to understand how to recreate it. Now the benefit of this is that once you've made one, you can reuse the structure for any arm you ever make, so thank goodness for that. Now this recipe will be in my ToonBoom Harmony cookbook, which I'm hoping to get out later in the year, so stay with me for that. Now the torso is often overlooked when turnarounds are created. Yes, the character looks great from all angles, now try bending her to tie a shoelace. Now the great thing about constraints is that deformers are still intact. I can therefore use deformers to change the shape of the body when using them and manipulate the torso position using the constraint system for a simple to use manipulation powerhouse. This took time to work out, particularly the boobs. Breasts should not look like a couple of tennis balls stuck to a tree trunk. Nor should they flop and float around like something from Benny Hill's Wet Dream. They should look like human flesh, subtly squishy like the muscles. This was achieved by creating a sub-network of duplicated constraints which had all the nails as the torsos, but with slightly different constraint parameters, so they deformed in a slightly different way to the rest of the body, resulting in more nuanced movement when the character bends forward and backwards. Now, when your character acts, the human body often rocks forwards and backwards as well as side to side, and this subtle movement makes all the difference when trying to get your character to act like a human as opposed to a balsa wood marionette. Also, the shoulders need to be pliant. The pectoral and shoulder muscles have to be simulated to give the impression of real flesh when the arm is raised, rather than a door handle attached to a loaf of bread. So since there is quite a bit of layering to achieve the desired effect, this also took a bit of time to work out. Now, it was around this time when I got a phone call from my mum. During the pandemic, my grandparents had been looked after largely by me in a virtual capacity, ordering their food, sorting out their bills, that sort of thing. This level of care was cranked up another notch when my grandmother decided to go out and water her plants when she fell onto the concrete and smashed into a zillion pieces. She fractured her pelvis, her arm and her shoulder, and she also contracted COVID-19 and was bleeding internally. Now, there was a brief period when it was suspected that she probably wouldn't last the night after a fairly intense operation. But amazingly, despite this woman having a broken hip, a bleeding pelvis, a shattered shoulder, and COVID-19, she makes a complete recovery. I mean, what the hell is this woman doing all day? Snorting lines of Super Mario invincibility stars, for God's sake. Now, she may be made from titanium, but both my grandparents still needed a fair amount of looking after, helping with the family coordinate their care, ordering his food, blah blah blah. So I was a bit spaced out for a few weeks while I was sorting all this stuff out. But I did manage to get my stuff done, gradually, until I fell ill. For 2 weeks I sat in my bed, drinking water and feeling nauseous, not doing anything except watching Camp 80s TV commercials and doing a sponsored vomit for my country. When I'd finally purged myself of all sickness, I was able to face the node views once more. Of course, I didn't understand any of them after 2 weeks, but I carried on working on her regardless. Now, the lower half of the body was in some ways more straightforward, since all the legs have to do is just bend around, though figuring the FK-IK difference was a bit of a challenge, and a bit like the shoulder part of the arm, the leg connects to the pelvis via the buttock, which moves in a slightly odd way. Remember, this isn't a Barbie doll. Anyway, I think I managed to do all that stuff. Once I played around with things, I noticed the limbs didn't quite behave themselves in the ways I liked, particularly the joints. Constraints enlarge things beyond their limits in a rather unhelpful way, and since the joint is beyond bone, both in front and behind, I needed yet again to redesign the system and fix the problem. After a bit of experimenting, I used the concept of a ball, unaffected by the constraining system, to kind of fill in the gap between the limbs' main muscle groups, which worked extremely well. I fixed the limbs, and I also figured out a way to make the hair flow more easily. I initially wondered if my mate Onionskin's video regarding tentacles was the way to go, since it created such nice flowing waves, but in the end I revisited the old node systems and dusted off the deformation wave node. A wild animal when first tamed, but with a few tweaks and adjustments, the beast is tamed and can yield some incredible results with very little effort. Now, all this took a fair amount of time to figure out, of course, but I got there in the end. Now, all that remained was to create a fairly easy to use interface for me to animate with, and that should be that. Now, I initially created master controllers to move the head and body and a few other bits and pieces. I also created quite a few which just toggle some controls on and off. The deformation scales, which litter the body, are awesome and easy to use, but hard to toggle on and off since they require you to actually drill down into the node view and select them first. They're also quite, messy looking. You don't want too many displayed at once, otherwise your eyes will dissolve. I created them all and then made a simple graphic and positioned all the toggles in the appropriate area to make the selection simple. Since the introduction of all these deformers, the puppet had to be put on a little CPU diet, so to counter counter all of this, I fed the puppet through a series of gates which could be toggled for lighter use, and I also figured out that cutters, even though there weren't a huge amount of them, were playing quite a significant part in slowing the puppet down. So I created a couple of gates to be able to turn those on and off at will, just in case, and it did improve things dramatically. All this, of course, is explained in my book. Please buy it, please. And there she is. Done. Now, if I were to make her again, she would be a lot faster, since I know what to do now, and I have all the methods to construct her. Like any puppet, there are things I probably would do differently, like the nose, possibly, and probably having to think about drawing subs for arm muscle manipulation rather than relying on deformers, but, well, anyway, there she is. She exists. And I can be released, and get on with the sodding advert, finally. I'm off for a gin and tonic now. I suggest you do the same. Oh, by the way, I created a thorough guide for ToonBoom Harmony as a book, so why not check the link for the advert and judge for yourself? You know, all you got to do is press the link and you're away, and you can see just how much work I've done. What, you don't want to click the link? What have I done? What have I done to you? What have I done to you that's so bad that you can't click the link? Come on, press the link, come on. Come on, you're doing me a favour. Just press the link, come on. Come on, press the link. Come on, press the link. Come on, you can do it. Press the link. Come on, press it. Press the link. Come on, press the link. Don't be a press the link. Come on, for you can do it, you're a press the link. Press the link for